My name is Renee Castillo. I'm 39 years old. My son Owen is 11 and has autism, high support needs, a trust fund his grandfather set up specifically to cover his care after we're gone. 14 months ago, Owen's caseworker called to ask why $15,000 was missing from that trust. I hadn't touched it. My husband hadn't touched it. The only other person with legal access was my mother-in-law, Sandra. By the time I found out what she'd actually spent it on, her kitchen had already been finished for 3 months. Her silent revenge stories. If you've ever felt like the people who were supposed to protect your child chose their own comfort instead, comment I hear you below. This one's for you. Owen was diagnosed with autism at 3, after 2 years of appointments and evaluations and a specific kind of exhausting hope that comes from watching your child struggle with things other kids do easily, without yet having a name for why. He's high support needs, nonverbal in stressful situations, prone to meltdowns triggered by changes in routine, requiring near constant supervision in a way that shapes almost every decision our family makes, from vacations to grocery runs to which restaurants we can realistically take him to. He's also, and I want to say this clearly before anything else in this story, one of the most joyful people I've ever known. He laughs with his whole body. He remembers the exact sequence of songs from every movie he's ever watched. He has a specific, delighted way of flapping his hands when something makes him happy that I would not trade for 100 quieter, more conventional childhoods. He has a particular love for trains, one that's followed him since he was 2, and he can tell you, without hesitation, the exact model and year of nearly every locomotive in his collection of picture books. He has a best friend at his school program, a boy named Marcus who communicates using a similar device to Owen's, and the two of them have a way of sitting together in comfortable silence that I've come to understand as its own form of deep friendship, even though it looks nothing like what friendship looked like at that age for me. My husband, Daniel, and I have spent the past 8 years building a life around Owen's needs. Therapies, specialists, a school with a program suited to him, a home modified in small but meaningful ways to keep him safe and regulated. Weighted blankets in specific spots around the house. A visual schedule taped to the inside of the pantry door. Noise-canceling headphones by the front door for the days the world outside is simply too loud for him to process without support. None of it has been easy, financially or otherwise, and both of us have had to make peace with a version of parenthood neither of us expected when we first talked about having kids, sitting in our first apartment a decade ago, imagining a future that looked considerably more conventional than the one we actually got. I wouldn't trade the one we got. I want to say that clearly too. But it's a future that requires more careful, sustained planning than most families ever have to think about, especially when it comes to what happens to Owen once Daniel and I are no longer here to advocate for him ourselves. When Owen was 5, Daniel's father, Richard, sat us down and told us he wanted to set up a special needs trust specifically for Owen's long-term care, a structure designed to provide for him without disqualifying him from the government benefits he'd likely need throughout his life, funded initially with $50,000 from Richard's retirement savings, with the explicit intention of adding to it over time. I've thought about this a lot, Richard told us that day, sitting at our kitchen table with paperwork spread out in front of him. I want to make sure Owen's taken care of no matter what happens to any of us. This isn't a gift with strings. It's specifically his, structured the right way, so it actually helps him instead of causing problems with his benefits down the road. It was, without question, one of the most generous and thoughtful things anyone has ever done for our family. Richard consulted a specialized attorney, structured everything correctly, and named 3 trustees with access, himself, Daniel, and, at Richard's insistence, since he wanted a backup in case something happened to him unexpectedly, his wife, Sandra, my mother-in-law. I remember Richard explaining, that day at our kitchen table, exactly why he'd structured it the way he had. A special needs trust has to be handled carefully, he told us, tapping the paperwork in front of him. If money just goes to Owen directly, it could disqualify him from the benefits he'll need, Medicaid, SSI, all of it. This way, the trust pays for supplemental things, quality of life things, without putting his baseline support at risk. I want him to have both. The government support and everything extra we can give him on top of it. I remember thinking, at the time, how much research he must have put into understanding all of this, hours spent with the attorney, hours reading about special needs planning, all of it in service of a grandson he clearly intended to protect for the rest of his life, regardless of what happened to the rest of us. I remember feeling, at the time, a genuine wave of relief and gratitude. Owen's long-term care was one of the things that kept me awake most nights, the specific fear of what would happen to him if something happened to Daniel and me before he was old enough, or capable enough, to manage independently. Richard's trust felt like a real answer to that fear, structured by people who loved Owen and understood exactly what was at stake. I never imagined I needed to worry about who else had access to it. Richard passed away 3 years ago, from complications after a stroke, leaving Sandra as the sole surviving trustee alongside Daniel. In the aftermath of his death, this detail barely registered as significant to me. Daniel was still a trustee, still had oversight, and Sandra had been present for every conversation about the trust's purpose from the very beginning. I had no reason to think her involvement changed anything meaningful. What I didn't fully appreciate, in the fog of grief that followed Richard's death, was how much day-to-day oversight of the trust's paperwork had quietly shifted to Sandra in practice, even though Daniel remained a legal co-trustee. Richard had always handled the actual administrative details, statements, disbursement requests, communication with the trust's attorney, and after he died, Sandra simply continued doing what she'd apparently been helping him with for years, while Daniel, still processing his father's death, was relieved not to have to take on one more responsibility during an already overwhelming time. Sandra's got the paperwork side handled, Daniel told me, maybe 8 months after the funeral, when I asked, casually, how the trust was being managed now that Richard was gone. She knows the process better than I do at this point. I trust her with it. I trusted her too. She was Owen's grandmother. She had held him as a newborn, learned his specific communication needs alongside the rest of us, shown up for every one of his birthdays with a gift chosen with real thought behind it. There was no reason, none at all, for either of us to suspect that trust was misplaced. About a year after Richard's death, Sandra mentioned, during a Sunday dinner, that she was finally renovating her kitchen, something I've wanted to do for 15 years, and now feels like the right time, she said, describing new cabinets, updated countertops, a layout change that would open the space up considerably. I remember being genuinely happy for her. Sandra had lived in that house for over 3 decades, and the kitchen, by her own admission, hadn't been updated since sometime in the 90s. It seemed like a reasonable, if significant, expense for a woman who had recently inherited a comfortable amount from Richard's life insurance and retirement accounts. I never once connected this renovation to Owen's trust. Why would I have? Sandra had her own money, her own accounts, entirely separate, as far as I knew, from anything related to Owen's care. The idea that she might be drawing from a fund specifically protected for her grandson's long-term needs simply didn't occur to me, because it was so far outside anything I would have believed her capable of doing. The call from Owen's caseworker, a woman named Patricia who'd been coordinating his services for years and knew our family well, came on an unremarkable Wednesday afternoon while I was making dinner. I have a routine question about Owen's trust, she said, her tone careful in the specific way professionals get when they're about to ask something they suspect might not have a comfortable answer. We're doing an annual benefits review, and I noticed a $15,000 disbursement from the trust about 11 months ago that isn't documented as being for anything related to Owen's care. Do you know what that was for? I want to make sure it's properly categorized before it affects his benefits eligibility. I told her I had no idea what she was talking about. I asked her to walk me through the date and amount again, slowly, while I grabbed a pen. $15,000, withdrawn 11 months earlier, almost exactly the timeframe Sandra had mentioned starting her kitchen renovation. Disbursements from a trust like this need to be for the beneficiary's benefit, specifically, Patricia explained. If this withdrawal wasn't for something related to Owen, it could actually jeopardize his benefits eligibility going forward, depending on how it's classified. I need to understand what happened here, for his file, as soon as possible. I stood in my kitchen, dinner forgotten on the stove behind me, feeling something cold settle into my chest that I recognized, even before I'd confirmed anything, as the specific, sinking certainty of understanding exactly what I was about to find out. I called Daniel at work, my voice tight enough that he asked immediately what was wrong. I told him what Patricia had said, watched, or rather, heard, over the phone, the same cold recognition settle into him that had already settled into me. "That's the same time Mom started the kitchen," he said slowly. "Renee, that has to be a coincidence." "It has to be." I wanted to believe that too. I spent that evening, after Owen was asleep, going through every bank statement and trust document I could access, looking for any innocent explanation, a medical expense we'd forgotten about, a legitimate disbursement for a therapy or piece of equipment that simply hadn't been documented correctly on Sandra's end. I found nothing that explained $15,000. What I did find, when I finally looked closely at the trust's disbursement history for the first time since Richard's death, was a pattern I hadn't noticed before, because I'd never had a specific reason to look: several smaller withdrawals over the preceding 18 months, each one modest enough on its own, a few $100s here, $1,000 there, that none of them had triggered the kind of review the $15,000 withdrawal apparently had. Individually, small enough to explain away. Together, they told a very different story. Daniel has a younger sister, Melissa, who lives out of state and has never had any involvement with the trust. She'd been present at the original conversation with Richard, years earlier, but had no legal role in managing it afterward. Daniel called her the same week we discovered the pattern, mostly to see if she knew anything, and partly, I think, because he needed to say the words out loud to someone who wasn't me, someone who'd known their mother far longer than I had. Melissa's reaction told us something important. She wasn't shocked in the way people are shocked by something entirely out of character. She was shocked, instead, in the specific way people are shocked when a suspicion they'd never quite let themselves examine turns out to be true. "She mentioned the kitchen to me too," Melissa said carefully. "I remember thinking it seemed like a lot, all at once, right after Dad died, when I know she wasn't working and hadn't gotten the life insurance payout yet at that point. I didn't ask where the money was coming from. I think some part of me didn't want to know." "Why not?" Daniel asked. Melissa was quiet for a moment. "Because she's our mother," she said. "Because it's easier to just be happy for her getting something she wanted than to ask hard questions about how she got it. I think I did the same thing you and Renee did, just from further away. I looked at the surface of it and decided not to look any closer." That conversation stayed with me for a long time afterward, the realization that Melissa's instinct not to ask, and our own instinct to trust completely, came from the exact same place, a desire to believe the people we loved wouldn't do something this deliberate to a child who couldn't advocate for himself. I didn't call Sandra that night. I sat, instead, in Owen's room after he'd fallen asleep, watching him breathe in the specific, peaceful rhythm he only has when his whole system finally gets to rest from a day of sensory input most people never have to consciously process at all. I thought about every appointment, every therapy session, every accommodation Daniel and I had fought for over 8 years to make sure Owen had the life he deserved. I thought about the specific terror I carried, quietly, most nights: what happens to him when we're gone, who makes sure he's safe and cared for and treated with dignity once we're no longer here to advocate for him ourselves. I thought, too, about the specific conversations Daniel and I had had over the years about Owen's future, the group home options we'd toured together, holding hands in parking lots afterward because touring them always left us both quietly devastated in a way neither of us fully knew how to talk about. The spreadsheets we'd built, late at night, trying to project what Owen's care might cost across a lifetime, what level of support he might need at 25, at 40, at 60, long after both of us would realistically be able to provide it ourselves. Richard's trust had been the thing that let us breathe a little easier during those late-night spreadsheet sessions, a real, structured answer to a fear that otherwise felt bottomless. Richard had built that trust specifically to answer that terror. He had sat at our kitchen table and told us, in his own words, that he wanted to make sure Owen was taken care of no matter what happened to any of us. And his own wife, Owen's own grandmother, who had held him as a newborn and learned his specific way of communicating love without words, had quietly, over 18 months, redirected a portion of that protection into new kitchen cabinets. I sat on the floor of Owen's room for a long time that night, the specific quiet grief of understanding that even the safeguards you build most carefully, with the people who love your child most, are not always safe from those same people's ordinary human weaknesses. I thought, too, about a conversation I'd had with Sandra just weeks earlier, at a family dinner, where she'd asked me, warmly, whether Owen's new sensory swing was helping with his evening meltdowns. She'd asked with what seemed like genuine care, genuine investment in the small, specific details of his daily life. I sat on that floor trying to understand how someone capable of asking that question with such apparent sincerity could also be capable of what the trust records now plainly showed. Daniel and I talked until nearly 2 a.m. that night, going back and forth between disbelief and a slow, painful acceptance of what the evidence actually showed. "I don't understand how she could do this," he said, more than once, his voice thick in a way I rarely heard from him. "This is Owen's trust, Renee. This is specifically, deliberately, the thing my dad built to make sure Owen would be okay. How does she look at that and see kitchen cabinets?" I didn't have a good answer for him. I still don't, fully, even now. "We need to talk to her," I said. "Before this goes any further with Patricia's review. I need to understand what actually happened, from her, directly, before I decide how angry I'm allowed to be about it." Daniel agreed, though I could hear, in his voice, a specific kind of grief that went beyond the money itself, the grief of realizing that a parent you'd trusted completely, especially in the aftermath of losing his own father, was capable of something this deliberate, this sustained, aimed at his own grandson's protection. We asked Sandra to meet us at our house, on a Saturday afternoon while Owen was at a supervised social skills group, specifically so he wouldn't be present for whatever this conversation turned out to be. She arrived looking entirely unaware of what was coming, cheerful in a way that made the next 20 minutes considerably harder to sit through. Daniel laid it out, his voice steady in a way I was grateful for, since my own composure was more fragile than I wanted to show. Patricia's call. The $15,000 withdrawal. The pattern of smaller disbursements over 18 months. The timeline lined up precisely against her kitchen renovation. Sandra's face went through several expressions, surprise, then something more defensive, before settling into an explanation she'd clearly had ready, perhaps for longer than either of us realized. "That trust has more money in it than Owen needs right now," she said. "I wasn't taking anything away from him. I was going to put it back eventually, once my house sells. I've been planning to downsize for a while, and once that happens, I was going to replace every dollar, with interest, honestly." "That's not how a trust works, Mom," Daniel said, his voice tightening. "You can't just borrow against Owen's protection because you assume there's enough cushion. That's not your money to assume anything about." "I'm his grandmother," Sandra said, her voice rising slightly. "I've given that boy everything I have for 11 years. I didn't think one kitchen renovation, borrowed temporarily, was going to hurt him in any real way." "It already has," I said, speaking for the first time since we'd sat down. "Patricia's reviewing his benefits eligibility right now because of this. If this gets classified wrong, it could actually affect the support he receives. This isn't hypothetical anymore, Sandra. It's already a real problem for him." That seemed to land differently than anything else we'd said. I watched something shift in her expression, not quite the full weight of what she'd done, but the beginning of it, the first real crack in the explanation she'd apparently been rehearsing for months. "I need you to understand something," Daniel said, his voice quieter now, more pained than angry. "Dad built that trust because he was scared of exactly this, not you specifically, but the idea that Owen's protection could get chipped away by anyone, even someone who loved him, if there wasn't enough oversight in place. You proved his fear was right. I don't think you meant to. But you did." Sandra's composure finally broke at that. "I don't want to be someone who hurt that boy," she said, her voice cracking. "I love him. You know I love him." "I do know that," I said, and I meant it, even in that moment. "But loving him and protecting what's his aren't automatically the same thing, Sandra. You showed us today that they're not the same thing for you, even if you never meant for it to be true." She sat with that for a long moment, quiet. quiet, the fight gone out of her posture entirely. "What happens now?" she finally asked. "Now we figure out how to fix it," Daniel said. "All of it. Every dollar, documented, with real oversight going forward. That's not up for negotiation. The only thing that's actually up for discussion is how much of a relationship with him you still get to have while we rebuild that." I asked her, directly, why she hadn't simply come to Daniel and me and asked for a loan, or explained that she was struggling to afford the renovation on her own and needed help, rather than quietly drawing from a trust that had nothing to do with her. She was quiet for a long moment. "Because I knew you'd say no," she said finally. "Or you'd make me justify every dollar, and I didn't want to have that conversation. I've spent 30 years in that kitchen, Renee. I just wanted this one thing for myself, without having to explain it to anyone or wait for anyone's permission." "You didn't have permission," I said. "That's the entire point. It was never a question of asking nicely enough. It was never yours to take in the first place, permission or not." She didn't have a real answer to that. I don't think there was one, not one that would have actually held up against the plain fact of what she'd done, sitting across from her own son and daughter-in-law, finally out of explanations that sounded reasonable once they were said out loud. She did say one more thing, quietly, before we ended that conversation, something that stayed with me longer than the rest of it. "Since your father died," she said, looking at Daniel, "I've felt like I don't matter to this family the way I used to. He was always the one who made the plans, made the calls, kept everyone connected. I felt invisible for 3 years, and I think, somewhere in my head, fixing that kitchen felt like proof that I still got to want something for myself, that I still existed as someone besides just his widow." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "That doesn't make it okay," he said finally. "But I hear what you're saying. I think, if that's true, we all should have been checking in on you more than we were. That doesn't undo what you did. But I don't think it's nothing either." I sat with that admission for a long time afterward, turning it over the way I'd turned over so many other parts of this story. It didn't make what she'd done acceptable. But it added a layer of understanding I hadn't expected to find room for, that grief, isolation, and a specific kind of invisibility that can settle over people after decades of being defined mainly through a spouse, can create the exact conditions where a bad decision starts to feel, quietly, like the only kind of agency still available. Daniel and I consulted an attorney who specialized in trust litigation, mostly to understand what our actual options were rather than because we'd already decided to pursue the harshest one available. The attorney confirmed that Sandra's actions constituted a clear breach of fiduciary duty. A trustee is legally required to act solely in the beneficiary's interest, and using trust funds for personal expenses, regardless of intent to eventually repay, was a serious violation regardless of the relationship involved. We had grounds to remove her as trustee immediately, to pursue full restitution, and, depending on how aggressively we chose to proceed, to potentially involve state authorities given the trust's connection to Owen's government benefits eligibility. We chose, in the end, a structured resolution rather than the most aggressive path available. Sandra was removed as trustee immediately, replaced by a professional fiduciary the attorney recommended, someone with no personal relationship to our family, whose only obligation was to Owen, exactly the way Richard had originally intended before circumstances quietly shifted more oversight onto Sandra than he'd ever planned. Sandra was given a formal repayment agreement, the full amount, plus a modest additional sum to help offset any impact on Owen's benefits during the review period Patricia was overseeing, repaid within 18 months, documented in writing by our attorney, with full transparency going forward, regular statements, no more informal access, no more assumption of cushion she wasn't entitled to assume. "This isn't about punishing you," Daniel told her, when we presented the agreement. "This is about making sure nothing like this can happen to Owen again, from anyone, ever. That's the only thing that actually matters to me right now." A few weeks later, Daniel and I sat down with the professional fiduciary our attorney had recommended, a woman named Grace who specialized specifically in special needs trust administration and had, she told us, seen situations like ours more often than either of us found comforting to hear. This happens more than people realize, Grace said, reviewing the trust documents in front of her. Not always with a family member, sometimes it's a well-meaning trustee who just doesn't fully understand the legal boundaries, or someone under financial pressure who convinces themselves it's temporary. The pattern is usually the same, though. Small withdrawals first, testing whether anyone's watching closely. Then larger ones, once nobody objects to the small ones. She walked us through exactly how she'd manage things going forward: quarterly statements sent directly to both of us, a formal request and approval process for any disbursement above a modest threshold, an annual audit conducted by an independent accountant unconnected to our family in any way. The goal, Grace said, is to build a system that doesn't rely on anyone's good intentions holding up indefinitely. Good intentions are wonderful when they hold. This trust needs to work even on the days somebody's don't. I found something strangely comforting in that framing, even in the middle of everything else we were processing. It wasn't about deciding, once and for all, whether Sandra could be trusted. It was about building something that didn't require betting Owen's future on anyone's trustworthiness holding steady forever, the same way Richard had originally tried to build it, before circumstances had quietly eroded the oversight he'd intended. Sandra did eventually sell her house, the same renovated kitchen that had started all of this, and used a portion of the proceeds to complete the repayment ahead of the 18-month deadline. I don't know if the sale was always part of her plan or whether it became one once she understood the full weight of what she'd have to make right. I remember Daniel driving past that house not long after the sale went through, on his way to something unrelated, and calling me afterward, his voice strange. "There's a family moving in with young kids," he said. "I saw them unloading a moving truck." I don't know why, but it hit me differently than I expected. That kitchen exists now for a family that has nothing to do with any of this, paid for, in part, by money that was supposed to protect Owen. I understood what he meant. There was something strange about an ordinary object, cabinets, countertops, a renovated space where someone else's children would eventually eat breakfast, carrying that much weight for our family, invisible to everyone who'd ever stepped foot in that kitchen without knowing its history. I tracked each payment carefully, the same clinical precision I'd learned mattered from other people who'd been through situations like this one: date, amount, running balance, method, documented and confirmed with the new fiduciary rather than taken on trust alone, the specific irony of that word not lost on me given everything that had happened. Patricia's benefits review, once she had documentation of the full restitution and the change in trustees, resolved without any lasting impact on Owen's eligibility, a relief that took months longer than it should have, given how carefully these things are scrutinized once a red flag has been raised, but a relief nonetheless. I called Patricia once the review had fully closed, mostly to thank her, for catching what she'd caught, for handling it with the careful professionalism she'd shown throughout, for asking the question that ultimately protected Owen in a way none of the rest of us had thought to ask ourselves. "This is honestly one of the harder parts of my job," she told me. "I flag something like this, and I know it's going to blow up someone's family, even when I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to do. I never enjoy that part. But I also know what it means for a kid like Owen if these accounts don't get watched carefully. I've seen cases where it wasn't caught in time, where the family relationship was too tangled to sort out before real damage was done to a kid's actual quality of life." I asked her how often this kind of thing actually happened, genuinely curious whether our situation was as unusual as it had felt from the inside. "More than people think," she said. "Not always this dramatic. Sometimes it's smaller, more understandable, a parent using a small amount for something that blurs the line between the child's needs and the family's needs generally. But the special needs population is specifically vulnerable to this, because the protections exist precisely because the beneficiary often can't monitor it themselves. That vulnerability cuts both ways. It's why the trust needs to exist, and it's exactly what makes it possible to exploit." That conversation gave me something I hadn't expected, a kind of professional, outside-the-family confirmation that what had happened to us wasn't some unique failure of judgment on our part, but a known, documented risk built into the very structure of protections like Owen's trust. Knowing that didn't undo any of it. But it helped me stop carrying quite so much private shame about not having caught it sooner myself. My relationship with Sandra today exists in a careful, limited form. We see each other at family gatherings. She's still Owen's grandmother, still shows up for his birthdays, still clearly loves him in the ways she always has. But she is no longer, and will never again be, someone with any access to decisions about his long-term care or protection. I think about Richard often in the context of all this, how deliberately he built that trust, how specifically he explained its purpose to us at our own kitchen table, how completely he trusted his wife to help protect it after he was gone. I don't think he ever imagined the exact way that trust would eventually be tested, or by whom. I don't think Sandra set out, in the months after Richard's death, to become someone who took from her own grandson's protection. I think she made one decision, under the specific loneliness and financial adjustment that comes after losing a spouse of 40 years, that felt survivable and temporary, and then kept making it, quietly, for 18 months, until a routine benefits review forced the whole pattern into daylight. That doesn't excuse it. But it helps me hold something more complicated than simple anger, which has been necessary, I think, for any version of a relationship with her to continue at all. The first time Sandra came to our house after the new fiduciary agreement was finalized, several months after the confrontation, I remember feeling a specific kind of watchfulness I hadn't felt around her before, even during ordinary family visits. She brought Owen a gift, a new train book, carefully chosen, exactly the kind of thoughtful detail she'd always been good at, and sat with him on the living room floor for almost an hour, going through it page by page while he flapped his hands with the specific delight only trains ever seemed to produce in him. I watched them together from the kitchen doorway, holding a dish towel I'd stopped actually using several minutes earlier, and felt two things at once, clearly, without either one canceling out the other: genuine warmth, watching her be exactly the grandmother Owen had always known, and a persistent, quiet vigilance that I understood, even then, wasn't going away anytime soon, maybe not ever entirely. Before she left that day, Sandra caught me alone in the kitchen. "Thank you for letting me still be part of his life," she said. "I know I didn't earn that back easily. I know I might not have earned it back at all, if you'd decided differently." "You didn't earn it back completely," I told her, honestly. "You earned back a version of it." I think that's the most honest way I can describe where we are right now. She nodded, accepting that without argument, in a way that felt different from the version of her who'd sat across from us weeks earlier still reaching for justifications. I don't know if that shift was permanent. I've learned, over the past year, not to assume permanence about anything related to trust that hasn't yet had enough time to prove itself. Owen communicates differently than most people, and explaining something like this to him required a version of honesty shaped specifically for how he processes the world, concrete, simple, tied to something he could understand directly rather than abstract concepts of trust and fiduciary duty. What I told him, in the simplest terms I could manage, was that Grandma Sandra had made a mistake with money that was supposed to help keep him safe, and that Mom and Dad had fixed it, and that new rules were in place now to make sure it couldn't happen again. Owen listened, in his own way, processing it with the specific stillness he gets when something matters to him even if he doesn't have the words to respond directly. Later that day, unprompted, he brought me a drawing he'd made. Owen draws constantly, careful, detailed pictures of things that matter to him, of our family, all of us including Sandra, standing together in front of what I recognized, after a moment, as our house rather than hers. I don't know exactly what that drawing meant to him, and I've learned not to overinterpret Owen's communication in ways that serve my own narrative rather than his actual intention. But I keep that drawing on my refrigerator now, and I think about it often, a reminder that even in the middle of adult betrayals and legal restructuring and careful, documented repayment plans, the person at the center of all of it was simply a boy who wanted his family, complicated as it now was, drawn together in one place. I belonged to a parents' support group for families of children with high support needs for almost as long as Owen has been diagnosed, a small, steady group of women who understand, in a way almost nobody else fully does, the specific texture of this kind of parenting. I brought this story to them, eventually, several months after everything had settled into its new, careful shape. I expected sympathy. What I got, more usefully, was recognition. 3 separate women in that group, it turned out, had their own versions of this story, not identical, but recognizable in shape. A grandparent who'd borrowed from a special needs savings account. An uncle who'd used a nephew's disability benefits to cover his own bills for months before anyone noticed. A sibling who'd been named trustee and simply stopped communicating with the family entirely once questions started being asked. It's a specific kind of vulnerability, one of the women, Priya, told me. These trusts and accounts exist because our kids can't always advocate for themselves. And it turns out that same vulnerability, the reason the protection exists in the first place, is exactly what makes it possible for someone to take advantage of it without our kids ever being able to say anything about it themselves. That conversation reframed something for me. This wasn't just a personal betrayal specific to Sandra. It was a structural vulnerability that families like mine live with constantly, one more item on the long list of things we have to actively guard against that most parents never have to think about at all. Knowing I wasn't alone in it didn't undo what had happened, but it did something almost as valuable. It helped me stop treating it as a uniquely personal failure of my own judgment, and start treating it as a systemic risk I now understood how to guard against going forward. People who hear this story sometimes expect me to say we cut Sandra off entirely, that this was the clean, dramatic rupture that ends a relationship for good. It wasn't, and I think it's more honest to say so, even though the simpler version might make for a cleaner ending. What happened instead was something harder to summarize. I learned that even the safeguards built by people who love your child most, with the best intentions in the world, are only as strong as the ongoing oversight behind them. Richard built something remarkable for Owen. But he couldn't build a trust that protected itself indefinitely, without anyone watching closely enough to notice when its purpose quietly started to drift. I used to think the hardest part of raising a child with high support needs was the day-to-day work of it, the therapies, the meltdowns, the constant vigilance most parents never have to sustain for a lifetime rather than a phase. I've since learned there's a different kind of hard, discovering that even the long-term protections you thought were secure require the same vigilance, the same willingness to ask uncomfortable questions of people you love, that everything else about this life requires. I don't regret trusting Sandra as a co-trustee in the first place. I think Richard's instinct to build in a backup, someone who loved Owen and could step in if needed, was a reasonable one. What I regret is not asking for regular, transparent statements as a matter of course, treating "she's got the paperwork handled" as a complete answer rather than the beginning of an ongoing responsibility that needed real oversight, regardless of how much anyone involved loved my son. There's a bench in a small park near Richard and Sandra's old house, installed the year after he died, with a plaque bearing his name, something the neighborhood association put together, since Richard had spent years volunteering to maintain that park's gardens in his retirement. I go there sometimes, usually alone, when I need to think something through that doesn't have an easy answer yet. I sat there not long ago, months after the fiduciary agreement was finalized, turning over everything that had happened over the preceding year. I thought about the specific care Richard had put into explaining the trust to us at our kitchen table, the hours he must have spent with his attorney making sure it would actually protect Owen the way he intended. I thought about how impossible it would have been for him to imagine the exact way that protection would eventually be tested, not by strangers, not by some abstract financial risk, but by the person he'd trusted most to help carry his intentions forward after he was gone. I don't think Richard would want this story to end in permanent estrangement from Sandra. I think he'd want exactly what we ultimately built, real consequences, real oversight, a relationship with real boundaries rather than no relationship at all. I think he understood, better than most people, that love and protection aren't automatically the same thing, and that sometimes protecting the people you love most means building systems that don't depend entirely on anyone's good intentions holding up forever, including your own. I sat on that bench for a long time that day, the way I imagine Richard once sat in that same garden, thinking about the specific, deliberate care it takes to protect the people who can't always protect themselves, and how that care doesn't end once the paperwork is signed. It has to keep being renewed, checked, watched over, for as long as it's needed, by whoever is left to do the watching. If there's a lesson in this, it's one I didn't expect to learn from my own mother-in-law, of all people, at a stage in life when I thought the hardest lessons about protecting Owen were already behind us. Love for a child, even real, demonstrated, lifelong love, isn't the same thing as reliable stewardship over what protects that child long term. They can coexist in the same person. They can also, quietly, come apart from each other, under the right pressure, in ways that take a caseworker's routine phone call to finally reveal. Owen's trust is fully restored now, under careful professional management, with transparency built into every part of it going forward. I check the statements every quarter, not out of suspicion exactly, but out of the same ordinary vigilance I've learned applies to every other part of protecting a child who can't always advocate fully for himself. I think Richard would understand that vigilance, even if the reason behind it would have broken his heart. If you've ever discovered that a safeguard you trusted completely had quietly been compromised by someone who loved you, I'd love to hear how you found out, and what you did once you knew. Let me know in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one coming every week.